first episode of Talking Geopolitics, the brand new podcast from the team at Geopolitical Futures. I'm your host, Christian Smith in London, and every fortnight we're going to take you on a journey around the global Geopolitical Futures team. From Austin, Texas to Moscow, Bucharest to Beirut. We're going to try and understand international affairs through the lens of geopolitics, and how that lens can help us forecast the future. If you're new to Geopolitical Futures, we are an online publisher founded by the New York Times best-selling author George Friedman in 2015. We tell the continuing story of the future by charting the course of the international system. Sound a bit implausible? Well, not if you know how it's done, and we'll be speaking with George about how that works later in the podcast. On each episode, we'll be giving you a snapshot of what Geopolitical Futures does, from putting into context current events like impromptu US military drills in the Black Sea, to analysis of the more permanent features of the international system, like Russia's obsession with its western border. We'll speak to different analysts about what they're watching and about the fundamentals of geopolitics. We'll also sit down with George for a virtual fireside chat to discuss what's been on his mind. There's an ocean of international news out there. Sifting through it can sometimes feel overwhelming. We're here to tell you what really matters, what you should be paying attention to. This isn't about political partisanship. It's about objective analysis of what is actually going to change the international system. On this episode, we're going to take a look at Ethiopia's clashes with Sudan, the tensions behind Russia's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, and George is going to give us his thoughts on, well, what geopolitics actually is. But we start with a hark back to 1962. Cuba has been drawing attention recently with its moves to liberalize its economy amid a catastrophic economic crisis. With former patrons the Soviet Union and Venezuela no longer in a position to assist, an emerging contest between the US and China lends itself to plenty of Cold War parallels. To understand the geopolitical significance of the moment, I spoke to Geopolitical Futures Director of Analysis, Allison Fedirka. Cuba is a communist economy in a post-Cold War world. It's one of the few true bastions of communism left in the world, or at least it was until recently. Can you tell us what's going on with the Cuban economy?
Yeah, so right now the Cuban economy is not doing very well. And I know that we can say this about most economy these days in the COVID-19 world, but a lot of Cuba's economic problems predates the pandemic, and the pandemic really put a nail in the coffin for it, if you will. So as you mentioned, Cuba is a communist country, and so there's a lot of distortions in the economy as it's heavily managed by the government on Cuba. And over time, these distortions will accumulate. And right now, the Cuban economy is starting to pay the price for this. And in the past, they've managed to avoid having these kinds of stagnant growth, lack of money to buy imports such as fuel. This, of course, has ripple down effects into other sectors that are fuel intensive, like transportation or agriculture. And in the past, they've been able to deal with these problems by having a large sponsor to their economy, such as the U.S. at the beginning of the 20th century, the Soviet Union at the latter half of the 20th century. And ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, they've really struggled to get a strong patron. There's been a couple of short-term relief moments from Venezuela or Russia, but none of them have really been strong enough to have such an impact that it can really reverse the trajectory that the Cuban economy on, which at this point is downward. And the reason why we're looking at Cuba now is because it's approaching an inflection point with its economy. The pandemic shut down tourism, which is one of the most important sectors for the economy in that it's a huge source of foreign currency for Cuba. This is important for getting a lot of imports into the country. It's also important for the locals who can get access to foreign currency and buy goods on the black market with things that would normally not be accessible to them. And so when you take that away, then you start to see a lot of the problems in the economy become even more prevalent, even though they were always there. And so now what we're seeing is the Cuba government starting to worry about this by introducing a series of relief measures, right? Imagine kind of releasing a pressure on a carbonated beverage, and you kind of release it little by little, hoping that you don't have it explode while you're in the middle of the process. So they're introducing a series of economic changes to help alleviate pressure on the Cuban economy, such as allowing for more private enterprise by individuals, reforming the monetary policy of the country, trying to reduce some subsidies. And all of this is aimed at trying to remove some of the distortions that have accumulated over time and try to spur some confidence from investors to start injecting money into the economy.
Okay, now the geopolitical interest that's increasing, I think, touches on what you talked about, Cuba needing a sponsor. In a lot of ways, though, Allison, the situation with Cuba starts with China's ports. Why is that?
Cuba is extremely close to the United States. And so anybody that's interested in looking at the United States, applying pressure to the United States, looking for vulnerabilities in U.S. interests, they're going to gravitate and look towards Cuba. And so when we talk about China's ports, we're talking about China's approach to what Cuba could mean to China. If we think about the Cold War, we saw Russia use Cuba as the U.S. was using Turkey against the Soviet Union. And so in a similar way, we can say this about China's ports in Cuba. So the U.S. has a very strong presence in the South China Sea. It's been building alliances with other countries in the South China Sea. This, in turn, encircles China and makes it very difficult for Chinese ships to leave its ports and navigate freely and not have to worry about the presence of U.S. security forces or allied countries in the South China Sea. Now, China needs to have these ports freely flowing with goods because their economy depends on these exports. So while the U.S. has pressured China in the South China Sea, Cuba presents the opportunity for China to pressure the United States in terms of growing a potential presence on the island and having the Chinese presence hit the U.S. a little bit closer to home, just like how the South China Sea is close to China.
Cuba has long been of interest to the US, considering it's right next door. President Obama recently, of course, eased tensions with Cuba. President Trump reversed those actions. What is President Biden looking at doing? What is the US doing to kind of keep Cuba on side?
So I like what you said by asking both, what is President Biden doing and what is the U.S. doing to keep Cuba on the U.S. side? And I think it's an important distinction because the way the U.S. legal measures against Cuba are set up is that there's actually a lot of power that the U.S. president has to increase the severity of the sanctions that are in place and then decrease their severity, which is what you've illustrated as well when you mentioned the Obama moves and the Trump moves towards Cuba. Politically, doing anything stronger, such as removing the embargo on Cuba, would require some type of congressional action. And because of the divisive nature of Cuba in the United States, it's very difficult to get Congress to do anything like that because you're going to have strong opposition to any measures that would legally change the standing, especially to lift the embargo. And so there's a lot of domestic political constraint from the U.S. government taking any type of official action to address the Cuba question. It's possible that Biden could unilaterally use some of those executive powers to, again, open up a gesture, the same way that the Obama administration did. It does come at a high political cost, and right now Biden is not operating with a lot of political capital. So I wouldn't expect to see him do any major moves on this front because right now there's no reason compelling the U.S. to take action. If there was a huge imminent threat on the island and the U.S. was forced to take action, then obviously we would see greater activity from Washington on the Cuba front.
And what about the Chinese? You said before that China's obviously got a fair amount of interest already in Cuba. What does that look like? What is it going to look like?
So China's had a lot of interest in the Latin America region in the past few years. In South America, this was primarily geared towards extraction of natural resources. In Central America and the Caribbean, there's been a lot of activity for port development and things of that nature, some financing as well. For China, again, the value of the Caribbean is one, its proximity to the United States to try to grow a presence there, and then also the commercial value of being able to continue to export its goods to different areas and using that as a hub for port transfers to expand the reach of its exports across the globe. We've seen China doing several things in Cuba in terms of supporting the development of the telecommunications sector. And that's particularly of note because we've heard a lot of people talking about, including Geopolitical Futures, Huawei and the dangers that it could present to secure communications. And Huawei's basically developed the entire modern telecommunications infrastructure on the island. So a move like that is definitely going to get Washington's attention and put into question the security of telecoms, both on the island, the U.S. ability to enter that sector on the island in the event that the island does open up one day to more U.S. business, and also puts into question what is the reach of some of these equipment that China has given Cuba. Is there potential for that to be a threat to the United States? Because remember, it's only 90 miles away. So there's a lot to be brought into question in terms of just how much development China plans to continue in Cuba. Again, right now, it's not an imminent threat to the United States, but when you see a foothold like that taking shape, you can't help but pay attention and see where it might go next.
Well, paying attention is certainly something we'll be doing with that at Geopolitical Futures. Allison, thanks very much. Each episode, we're going to speak with a couple of Geopolitical Futures analysts about what they've been following or watching out for in the world of geopolitics. This episode, I spoke to GPF's Russia expert, Ekaterina Zolotova, who's in Moscow, and I also spoke to Allison Fedirka again, who's in Alexandria, Virginia. Ekaterina, you've been watching Russia's construction of its new pipeline Nord Stream 2 between itself and Europe, and that's been drawing a lot of attention in the last few weeks. Why is this pipeline so important?
Because it has become like a litmus test that shows the relationship between the two important geopolitical players, Russia and Europe. The construction of the Nord Stream is a really difficult issue. Upon its completion, Russia will theoretically receive one more pipeline to Europe, and Europe, especially Eastern Europe and Germany, will receive another reliable source of constant gas supplies. At the same time, the United States, Ukraine, and some European countries are opposing this expensive project because, according to them, it can increase Russian influence on the region. I cannot fully agree with this statement because everything depends on demand, on supplies, and diversification of supplies rather than only on completion of construction. I mean, it should start to work. The gas should pass this pipeline before. But at the same time, I agree that it is really a symbol of Russian-European cooperation. Also, the eastern part of Europe remains dependent on Russian gas supplies. And the issue of supplies is especially important during cold winters. For example, right now we have the situation when France began to urgently buy Russian gas because of cold weather that hit Europe. And I think that Russia hopes that this case will convince the number of European countries for the need of the Nord Stream in the future.
All right, and why has it been causing so much stress recently?
Well, there are some publications in media that report that the United States and Germany have already begun negotiations on Nord Stream 2. Whether it's true or not, it is obvious that Berlin is thinking how to persuade the United States not to stop the completion of this gas pipeline by sanctions or any other means. Europe believes that with Biden's presidency, everything will change, well, especially the position of the United States towards Nord Stream will change, or at least the United States will make it a little bit easier to complete this expensive project. At the same time, the United States hasn't yet reached the final conclusion about the fate of the Nord Stream. The United States shows that Washington is ready to discuss easing the sanctions that were introduced earlier in order to make the American-European relations a little bit easier. But at the same time, the United States continue to monitor activities about the completion and construction of this pipeline. And also the United States said that they will decide on imposing the sanctions if they will see any Russian activity or they will see that it will have a very huge influence on the region. So the fate of the Nord Stream is not determined, and Germany and the United States don't have clear position on this. And at the same time, Russia still hopes that this pipeline will be complete very soon. To sum up, we can say that Nord Stream is a very political issue. And the solution of this issue shows the dynamics of the region. And of course, it will be always on our radar till it will be completed.
Allison, you've been taking a look at the conflict going on between Sudan and Ethiopia. What's the situation there?
This is a region that is starting to see a lot of potential for very serious conflicts and the intersection of a lot of different issues. Right now with Ethiopia and Sudan, one of the main issues that they have is a dispute over their border with military clashes occurring on a somewhat regular basis now. The other issue that they have is the filling of the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, and Egypt is also involved in this issue. It's a critical existential issue for Ethiopia. Without water, and the dam threatens the flow of the water into Egypt, Egypt is going to have some severe problems. So it becomes a question of how is it going to mitigate this risk. It's been working with Sudan to resolve this issue. Sudan now has its own separate issue with Ethiopia over this border dispute. And we're just starting to see this intersecting with that. It also intersects with ethnic violence in Ethiopia. It starts to bring in some issues with South Sudan because they're trying to help mediate this conflict and they have their own domestic problems. Sudan's economy is also experiencing severe stress and showing signs of problems there. And Ethiopia is a linchpin of stability in the region. So if we see something set off Ethiopia or we see a trickle domino effect of conflicts, it's going to pull in a lot of major powers like the United States, Turkey, Russia, all of these guys that are in the area. They have bases in the area. They have relationships with these countries. And so we're just watching because the level of potential conflict with major players is high, and the overlapping problems of a myriad of conflicts means that one spark could really have a large domino effect in the region.
Allison and Ekaterina, thank you both very much. Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis. Now, as promised, each episode will be joining Geopolitical Futures chairman and founder George Friedman, who's in Austin, Texas, to chew the fat about what's grabbing his attention in the world. And for this first episode, we thought we'd start at the very beginning. Not Genesis, that is, geopolitics. Geopolitics, I'm finding in particular, is a word that it seems to almost be having a renaissance amongst journalists in particular, but it seems to be used as a bit of a catch-all to describe any kind of relations between countries and the wider global system. It's obviously not that. So what is geopolitics?
There's one thing we all have in common. We were born in a certain place, we live in a certain place, and that place has shaped us. If you were born in Sri Lanka, you've had a very different life than if you were born and live in Brazil or the United States or wherever. We are, in large part, where we were born. And because of that, certain things are impossible to us, certain things are easy to us. And when we take all of us together, we were all born in the same place, and that's the foundation of community. Having been born in the same place, we speak the same language, we frequently pray to the same gods, and we have a similar fate. And what this really is, when we talk about geopolitics, is not international relations in a kind of broad way. It is a very specific understanding of the constraints, the forces that shape our personal and everyday lives, and that of the nation and how those nations interact.
What are those factors, do you think? What are the things that we are watching out for that are tells of what will happen, of what will influence a nation's or a region's interactions with the outside world?
Well, obviously, as with any human being, the economics. I mean, the economy of our household, the economy of the nation, that determines what we need and what we have and so on. Then there's, of course, the military aspect. Nations constantly make war on other nations. Nations have wars within themselves. And when you're caught in the middle of that, that defines who you are and a great deal more. And finally, there's the political, the manner in which we govern ourselves. And when you take a look at geopolitics, it is those three characteristics, those three dimensions that are, among many others, but are the heart of the geopolitical, the economic, the political, the military.
The word that obviously catches my eye in geopolitical futures is futures. And obviously, I know that you've built a lot of your career on the idea that if we understand these factors, if we can appreciate them, look into them, see what they are for what they are and what they mean, we can then take that and make a forecast, obviously, of the future in some kind of way, of the likelihood of future events. How does geopolitical futures approach geopolitics? And in turn, how does this help us make those forecasts?
Well, the most important thing to understand is what is impossible. Just as in our lives, there are certain things that we simply aren't going to be able to do. I'm not going to be a decathlon runner. That's not going to happen. If we understand a nation, we understand the constraints that are on it, the things that force it in certain directions. And when we understand that, we understand two things. Firstly, we understand what the nation cannot do. And we also get a sense of what the nation must do, just as with an individual. And if we understand those two things, then we're in a position to start saying what direction this nation will move, what the relationship between one nation and another will be, and all of that. So if we take a look at all these things, economic, political, and military, and say, what is impossible and what is necessary? Now suddenly we have the ability to begin forecasting what will be.
One of the important things that geopolitical futures sees in the world is that the role of individuals is much less significant than, in particular, the mainstream media, I suppose, but also, most people in general see. I mean, and I think that a case in point of that is the election of U.S. presidents. The difference between whether a Democrat or Republican is elected actually matters significantly less than we like to think. I just want to somewhat challenge you on that, in the sense that might be quite an easy assumption to make, say, in the 2004 election with George W. Bush and John Kerry. But, the influence of someone like Donald Trump has surely challenged the idea that individual leaders are less important. Or do you not think so?
Well, I lived through Richard Nixon, who was the most horrible person, a criminal, and almost impeached, had to resign and everything else. And extraordinarily, the nation continued onward in spite of it. In terms of foreign policy, Obama set the basic parameters of U.S. foreign policy. First, that we withdraw from the Middle East. Second, that we confront China on economics. And thirdly, that we contain Russia and the Ukraine and so on. Donald Trump's foreign policy was exactly the same. He wanted to withdraw from the Middle East. He wanted to confront China, and did. He wanted to limit the ability of the Russians to expand, which he did by placing troops in Poland. So the interesting thing is, if we forget the histrionics of Trump, if we forget to support his brilliance, if we forget everything else, you had Obama's policy being followed by Trump, and Trump's foreign policy pretty much being followed by Biden, according to what he says. So one man is not going to govern in the sense of control a nation of 330 million for two reasons. First, he had to struggle his way to become president. And that already makes him more in common with other presidents than with other people. The number of us who could possibly imagine, have the nerve to do that and have the discipline of doing it, to rise to the president of a country this large, is very, very few. And in addition to that, once he's there, he's surrounded by massive forces containing him and controlling him. The nation is very powerful. So the idea that he is somehow a dictator or monarch is really very silly. And you should also note how, interestingly, the system destroyed Donald Trump at the end of the game. He did not get reelected. He is in deep trouble in many different ways. he just wasn't that important, although at the moment he seems an overwhelming force and Biden seems a lesser force. Yet what they do is guided by what they must do.
I think that's actually leads on very well to another point, which I know is something you're quite interested in, which is that there's a certain, there's an inevitable philosophical underbelly of geopolitics in the sense that it tends towards more of a deterministic outlook, an outlook that says the future is not unpredictable. It's not determined, but it is definitely heading along a certain path. It's not, it's somewhat Adam Smith's invisible hand in some ways. It's not at the other end of the scale of anarchy where nothing means anything and anything can happen. How do you see that?
We tell our children there's nothing you can't be. Everything is possible. This is, of course, nonsense. They have talents, they have financial constraints, or what have you. So we each have limits, and ultimately we each also die. If we take a look at the pattern of our lives, they are determined. We are born, we are nurtured, we enter into economic life, we mostly marry, we die, okay? So the human condition is one of determinism. In many cases, in some cases, people break out to brilliant things. For the most of us, we just live our lives in very expected fashions. And so too, when we get together and become a nation. As a nation, we are simply a collection of individuals, and those individuals are living their lives, and the nation itself lives the life that it can, that it must, and so on. So the idea that a president can decide to do something extraordinary. Woody Allen had a wonderful movie called Bananas, where a dictator of Cuba declared that from now on, Cuba's language would be Swedish. It's a very funny line. It's funny because it's absurd. He doesn't have the power to do that. So if you look at leaders and realize what they can't do, if you realize what nations must have, if you understand the complexity of these nations in relation to just human life, you can see that there's an orderliness to it and a trap. I mean, we are all trapped by who we are, and so is our nation.
I want us to finish by putting all this, I suppose, theoretical chat into an example. Let's look at Eastern Europe, at the European plain, the European peninsula. Obviously, the 20th century was in large part dominated by Germany and by Germany's struggles with its neighbours, in particular towards the east. How significant is geopolitics, is geography in particular in that area?
Germany was not a nation until 1871 or so. It was fragmented and it united. And because of its wealth and because of its public, it became fantastically successful economically, bypassing the French rapidly, challenging the British. The Germans are also aware of the fact that they were very weak. The French were to the west, the Russians to the east, and they both attacked at the same time. Well, then, what in the world would they do? They would lose. So they discovered that as wealthy as they became, and this is a rule of geopolitics, the wealthier you are, the weaker you are, the more danger you're in, they would have to start the war and take the French out and then move against the Russians. And they did that. In 1939, with a very different leader than Wilhelm, Hitler, he did exactly the same thing. Fearing a simultaneous attack by the French and the Russians, he attacked first France and this time took them out and then failed to succeed. Now, the reason he failed to succeed is that another power decided to intervene, and that was the United States, and we'll go into how that happened. But the point is there's a consistency in foreign policy, although not in the monstrous internal behavior of Hitler as compared to Wilhelm. There's a consistency of it. And you see that developing today, too, where the Germans are toying with the Russians, I should say, where the Germans are toying with the United States. They're trying very hard, once again, to define their place in Europe within the context of the EU and everything else. And many nations, their neighbors, are quite nervous about what they're doing. And others are trying to take advantage of it. So over the course of a century, the German experience in terms of international affairs has been quite consistent. It's varied internally, but that internal is, of course, vital and somehow outside the range of geopolitics.
George Friedman, thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to speaking to you again next time.
Looking forward to it, Christian.
That's all for this first episode of Talking Geopolitics. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you again soon. You've been listening to Talking Geopolitics from the team at Geopolitical Futures. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to Talking Geopolitics wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll be notified when a new episode becomes available. For more information and special offers for podcast listeners, go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.